Mr. Sandman is the 12th fight in Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, and as we near the end of the game, there is a noticeable difficulty spike for casual players. Sandman's tells are lightning quick. If you blink at the wrong time, he'll give you a one-way ticket to Dreamland. On the other hand, speedrunners have had their own set of problems. Sandman's quick guard makes sneaking punches through impossible, and the ability to get stars is locked until round 3, making it difficult to deal damage quickly. As such, this is the only fight in the game where even the perfect run can't go faster than 2 minutes. This is the world record history of Mr. Sandman. For the longest time, a fast strategy for Mr. Sandman didn't exist. Actually, forget about a fast strategy. No one had even beaten this guy in the first round, and esteem only held between him and Mike Tyson in the early 2000s. The major problem with both of these fights is that it's very difficult to deal damage quickly. For the first 50 seconds of Mr. Sandman, he performs these quick rolling jabs in sets of 5, and you can only counter-punch back a single time. If you pay really close attention, countering the left-sided rolling jab seems to do a normal amount of damage, but countering the right-sided ones does barely anything at all. Either way, for the first 50 seconds, you make little progress through his life bar. After 50 seconds, his pattern changes. He now mixes it up with hooks and various delays, and rarely even a couple of rolling jabs. If you counter every single one of them in his fastest pattern, you'll get close, but not knock him down before the minute 30 deadline. It was known that instead of waiting for the hooks, you could force Sandman to throw them, but on average, this is only marginally faster. You could not knock him down before a minute 30. This was a big problem because there is only one way to deal a lot of damage very quickly to Sandman, and that was by countering his special move, known to Punch-Out speedrunners as the Dreamland Express, or DLX. Countering the DLX allows you to land not only a huge amount of consecutive gut punches, they do even more damage compared to the gut punches you deal on the hooks. The massive problem was that Sandman was already at low health, so all the potential damage you could deal was wasted. 1 minute 30 was the only trigger for a Dreamland Express in round 1, and because of this, you would not be able to knock him down twice more within the round time limit. In late 2001 or early 2002, Red Tom would document the first ever method to beating Mr. Sandman in round 1, and it involved one of the strangest looking moves in the game. Instead of forcing hooks with face jabs, you could instead force jabs with gut punches. What Red Tom noticed was that these jabs were a little different to the ones from the first 50 seconds of the fight. Immediately after Sandman blocks your punch, you could buffer a face punch which would connect just before Sandman's punch hits you. Using this technique, Red Tom was able to get the first knockdown before the minute 30 deadline, so he was able to use the DLX to drain Sandman's second life bar, and then to finish off the fight, more of these strange gut counters. This strategy was flawless, extremely easy to pull off, and the few random factors in the fight didn't matter. But there was still a huge problem. No other player was able to replicate it. Red Tom had suspected that the other players had simply misunderstood what he had told them, or that he had failed to describe what he had done correctly, but he hadn't. When other players tried the same technique with the weird gut punches, they found that Sandman's punch would connect before Little Mac's, making the only advantage of Tom's strategy completely useless. They even tried using the slightly weaker but faster left gut punch, but this just resulted in double hits where only Mac would take damage. Oh, and I guess it also led to the discovery of this pretty funny graphical glitch known as Midget Sandman. Still, Red Tom wanted to know why his strategy wouldn't work for anyone else, and slowly, everyone learnt that it was because of regional differences. Europe uses the PAL standard for their TVs, whilst North America and Japan use the NTSC standard. Most games were designed and optimized for NTSC play, but to make them compatible on PAL hardware, the developers would have likely performed some simple scaling changes, rather than reprogramming a separate version optimized to play at 50 Hz. This simple scaling led to this weird interaction where the same strategy wasn't possible on the NTSC version of the game. As the months passed by, a round 1 strategy for Mr. Sandman on NTSC remained elusive. At this point, even Mike Tyson had now been defeated in the first round, and people began to believe that maybe a round 1 strategy was just not possible. Even Red Tom began to have his doubts about whether a strategy would ever be found. But in November of 2002, the few remaining believers combined all of their Sandman knowledge, experience, and experimentation together, and it was Red Tom who spearheaded the first ever Mr. Sandman Round 1 victory on NTSC. Here's how he did it. For the first 50 seconds of the fight, Tom just dodged and countered the rolling jabs like normal. I mentioned before that Sandman throws them in sets of 5, but there is also a variable delay between each set. If you execute fast, you can get Sandman to throw 11 punches, which means you have to negotiate 2 potential delays. It's very likely that Red Tom needed to get both short delays to make this strategy work. At the 50-second point, Red Tom began to execute his new move, which he called the Nightmare. He would force a hook, counter once in the face and once in the gut, and then instead of completing the counter, he would perform a single delayed right gut punch which would deal more damage than normal. Red Tom would repeat this process, and although the delay would lose a little bit of time, the punch itself dealt significantly more damage, and Red Tom was able to get a first knockdown at 128. If he had gotten a 129 or any later, he would have ended up skipping the trigger for Sandman's Dreamland Express. For the first time ever, Red Tom would be able to fully utilize the DLX's damage potential, and when that was over, he went back to using his signature nightmares. What's even funnier is that it's likely that Red Tom also got bad luck in Phase 3. Sandman has 2 refills, and for once in this game, the better one is more likely. 75% chance for a 64 HP refill. If Tom had gotten the low refill, he most likely would have gotten a time in the low 250s or even high 240s, but instead, he finished the fight with a world record time of 2 minutes and 57 seconds. At last, all 14 fights in the game had been beaten in round 1. As revolutionary as this fight was, it was far from perfect. At the end of Phase 1, Red Tom had to force an entire hook in order to deal this tiny sliver of damage. Well, this could easily be rectified by simply performing 2 quick gut punches during the Nightmare, dealing 1 extra damage but saving 3 seconds. Over the next month, Brian Sulphur would lower the record with all these tiny optimizations and getting better luck, down to a time of 242.99 seconds. Brian Sulphur had grinded the strategy down to near perfection, as even Matt Turk believed it to be unbeatable unless something new was found. In early 2003, Matt Turk received an email from Jack Wedge talking about forcing Sandman to do the Dreamland Express a second time. A breakthrough like this would be huge and would surely lead to much lower times. Turk would confirm Jack's theory, but also noticed there was a pretty hefty drawback. In order to get another Dreamland Express, you would have to get knocked down, and after getting up, Sandman would perform his special attack again. Obviously, this takes some time to do, but dealing damage by countering the DLX is also the fastest way to damage him, so it could be worth it. You might be thinking that since you can barely deal damage to Sandman in the first 50 seconds, why not let him smash you with his rolling jabs? Then you can get a free Dreamland Express to counter. Well, there was unfortunately another stipulation. Sandman would only perform this type of Dreamland Express if you got knocked down after a certain amount of time had passed. And back then, best estimates of this time were 159 plus a little bit extra. After doing some testing, Matt and Jack workshopped their way through the fight, figuring out where the best places to take damage were. They realized that Sandman's opening rolling jab pattern would always go right, left, right, left, then a small variable delay before repeating. Since Little Mac dealt barely any damage on the right-sided rolling jabs, it'd be best to get hit by those, and beautifully, by the end of the first 50 seconds, Little Mac only had a small chunk of health left. After progressing through the fight like normal from here with Nightmares and Extended Nightmares, the ones with 2 gut punches before the delayed hit, a second knockdown at 208 could be achieved. As soon as Sandman got up for the second time, they would immediately force a hook which would knock down Mac. With the timer well past 159, Sandman would get up, and after a little luck again by getting the fastest delay, he would throw his DLX immediately. Jack and Matt named this strategy the Philadelphia Sleeper, and with it, Matt Turk was able to set 2 world records, a 241.25 and a 238.61 in May of 2003. Over the next few months, nothing else was found that could improve the Sandman time. Most of the fight was buffered, just forcing hooks as soon as possible and performing gut punches on Sandman as soon as the next one was available. This is typical of the strategy evolution for Mr. Sandman. There aren't any fancy star punches to work with, which is just one less thing to consider. Nevertheless, the Philadelphia Sleeper was obsoleted in September of 2003. The new strategy, aptly titled Enter Sandman, is credited to having been developed by both Matt Turk and Martin. In reality, everything about Enter Sandman was exactly the same as the Philadelphia Sleeper, except for the change of a single punch found by Martin. At the end of the DLX counter, Martin discovered that it was possible to perform a very tricky delayed gut punch, slightly increasing the damage of the final hit. This punch is frame perfect and was known as the Kruger, as in Freddy Krueger. Enter Sandman utilized this delayed hit on the DLX at the end of the fight, as it was able to cut out an entire forced hook. Using this, Turk was able to get a 237 flat, and then Martin was able to one-up him with a 236.99 a few days later. Just before the new year rolled around, the Kruger and Enter Sandman were obsoleted. Matt Turk realized you could perform a similar face punch in the exact same spot, dealing the same amount of damage with a much wider window. This was called the Wacky Waker. This would make the fight far easier to execute, as he was going to perform another delayed hit on the first DLX at 130, cutting out another forced hook at the end of phase 2. In combination with this, he also pioneered pressing select before the fight to reduce max health by half. Pressing select looks like it would save a lot of time, but the pitiful damage you would deal by countering the jabs instead makes it barely worth it. In fact, Turk figured out that countering too many would end up costing him time. In the first 50 seconds, Sandman is able to throw 5 right-sided rolling jabs. 2 are needed to bring max health down to the brink so he could get knocked down later, and 1 was counted to deal the minimal damage. The other 2, however, Turk just dodged and let Sandman's pattern continue. Countering these 2 punches instead would take up a handful of extra frames due to the animation, and this would cause Sandman to throw a valuable left-sided jab just before 50 seconds, which should be counted. By the time the animation was over, the clock was already nearly at 52 seconds, and now you've ended up wasting time because you've not been able to force hooks as soon as possible. The decision to completely leave 2 right-sided hooks was genius, in the sense that it's not an obvious solution, and how much Turk was min-maxing the hell out of the new strategy. The inclusion of select and 2 wacky wakers prompted Turk to call this strategy Sandman's Last Rites, and with it, he was able to bring the time down another couple of seconds to a 234.97 on December 22nd, 2003. As you can probably tell, developmental progress on Sandman was quite slow. Inclusions of punches like the Kruger or Wacky Waker and pressing select before the fight were enough to warrant a named strategy back in the day. The fact of the matter is that Sandman is a fight where you basically have to play by his rules. One might describe the strategies in this fight rather dry or repetitive, and once the Kruger got replaced by the Wacky Waker, rather trivial to execute as well. There were a few pieces of luck needed to get the fastest times, of course, but overall, it was only about 1 in 22 to get it all. So what was going to happen next? Some new punch was going to be found that was going to drop the time by another 2 seconds? No. What happened over the course of 2004 was that the Mr. Sandman time dropped from a 234.97 all the way down to 221.25, more than 13 seconds. This was mainly down to 2 new major time-saving tricks. In their quest to save even more time, Matt Turk and everyone else had begun to start cutting their punches tightly, particularly on all the delayed punches. As long as they weren't using the Kruger, each one had about a 6-frame window to land, but the earlier you hit that window, the sooner you could force Sandman's next punch. Aside from this, Turk noticed 2 other potential spots where players were giving up some obvious frames. On the 2 sets of Dreamland Expresses, everyone had been slow dodging the first 2 punches and quick dodging the final one. Well, why not quick dodge the other 2 punches as well? It seems strange, but Sandman sort of knows what type of dodge you're going to do, so he adjusts the speed of his uppercut to allow you to quick dodge without dodging too early. This is a beautiful piece of game design by the developers to reward better players. But you know what it also does? It allows you to land 4 more stunned hits on Mr. Sandman. With the extra damage dealt on each of the Dreamland Expresses, 2 more forced hooks and extended nightmares could be taken out of phases 2 and 3, and with this, Matt Turk was able to drop the world record down to a 227.48 in March of 2004. The next development wouldn't come until near the end of the year when the Phil and Janisto TAS dropped. These guys figured out a way to get even more damage out of the rolling jabs in the first 50 seconds of Phase 1. If I show you the normal damage values of what was happening before, you'll see that countering the right-sided jabs deals 1 damage, which is very low and barely worth it. But countering the left-sided jabs deal 4 damage, which is actually a pretty weird value, as primary hits usually deal 5. But still, 4 is way better than 1. What Phil and Janisto found was that you could block and counter the right-sided jabs, and then perform a delayed hit for 5 damage. Suddenly, the right-sided jabs are now more valuable. For some reason, the left-sided ones, Sandman recovers too quickly and you don't get a chance to block and counter. The advantage of this was getting the first knockdown far earlier, and now you could perform 2 nightmares before the 130 DLX, and with the triple quick dodge, you could now get your second knockdown well before the 159 mark. Less than a month after this TAS came out on November 5th, Turk was able to lower the time again to a 221.25. Over the next 5 years, Turk refined the strategy he was using, cutting the record down 3 more times until it sat at an even 220 flat. While Phil and Janisto's TAS was a 219.25, a little faster than Turk's time, it's difficult to say if Turk used this exact strategy, or he had made some adjustments with the help of a Delicate's TAS, which brought the theoretical limit to a 218 flat in the same year. Nevertheless, you know the deal with Turk. There wasn't any video proof of his times, but they were believed to be true with the amount of detail he provided in how he achieved them, and that was enough for Sinister One to begin his challenge for top spot on Mr. Sandman. When Sinister came onto the scene, there weren't any top players left actively playing the game, but he was still able to track Turk down and ask him about the 220 Sandman strategy. It wasn't long before Sinister was able to exactly match Turk's time down to the decimal at exactly 220 flat. Of course, with the TAS being at a 218 flat, maybe Sinister could inch his way closer there. Well, it turns out grabbing any part of those 2 seconds is very, very difficult. The key difference in these 2 fights is the ending time for Phase 2, where Sinister gets a 156 knockdown. This seems very good. As soon as Sandman gets up, Sinister can basically just force Sandman to hook and he takes his knockdown very close to the optimal time at a low 159. Now, if we watch the TAS get the second knockdown, we see that it gets it way earlier, at a low 153. This 3-second difference is actually huge. It allows the TAS to force a gut punch and deal a tiny bit of extra damage before forcing the hook to take a knockdown closer to a mid or late 159. Despite taking the knockdown a little later, this also means the TAS can get away with not having to do a delayed hit at the end of the fight to grab the extra damage. As you might have guessed, getting that extra jab in is a huge difference maker, but it does take up a significant amount of time. If Sinister had gotten a 155 or even a 154 second knockdown, going for that jab will end up causing him to lose time rather than gain. The TAS had only been able to save that much time by ruthlessly ducking every punch and hitting every delayed hit on the first frame. The TAS also allowed Sandman to naturally throw his hooks. There is a 3 and 8 sequence of punches which is just barely faster with optimal play. When forcing a hook, it's impossible to quick dodge perfectly since you're in the middle of the punch animation, but with natural hooks, you can dodge slightly earlier and even duck them to save an extra frame. All in all, there was more than a dozen tiny time saves, and if anyone wanted even the slightest of edges over Turk, they would have to get most of them to even begin using the extra jab to open Phase 3. While Sinister was on the cusp of taking the Sandman time from Turk, Turk shockingly lowered the time in January of 2011 to a 219.48 using the last viable time save in the TAS. The Dreamland Express is a pretty obvious tell. Sandman freezes and flashes briefly before unleashing the triple uppercuts. The flash is supposed to be your cue to dodge. If you try to anticipate this flash, you'll realize that you now end up getting hit. But if you dodge just a little earlier than that, you can completely bypass the freeze, and Sandman's first uppercut comes out instantly, saving half a second. Turk managed to implement this into the final DLX of the fight, and even finished off Sandman with the frame-perfect Kruger, which now had also been definitively shown to be 2 frames faster than a perfect Wacky Waker. Sinister would press on, setting his first sub 220 with a 219.97 6 months later, which he forgot to record, but a photograph of the final time was captured. Sinister would continue to inch closer and closer to Turk, this time grabbing a 219.82 in March of 2013. Sinister absolutely had the execution to surpass Turk on this fight. He just didn't risk committing to the instant Dreamland Express, instead waiting for the Flash to complete a safe fight. Ultimately, Sinister would not be the one to usurp Turk's .48. In 2013, after dominating the competition of Super Punch-Out and Punch-Out Wii, Zalad was now just getting into Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. You can tell these were real early days in Zalad's MTPO career. His personal best didn't even have a round 1 Tyson at the end. Even back then, Zalad's skill was visible as he was bravely ducking the opening jabs tightly on a PB-paced run, something even now would be considered needlessly risky. When the phase ended, he was astounded by the fact that he achieved a knockdown time of 118. While this still wouldn't be fast enough to get the extra jab, it was certainly a tipping point, because not long after this, Zalad believed he could be the one to take down Turk's time.
Yes! Oh my god, what is it? What is it? That looks kind of early. What is it? Holy shit, dude! Oh my god.
It had taken Zalad only about a week to break Turk's stranglehold on the Sandman world record, but Zalad was determined to lower it even further. He wanted to get a 218.61 or better. The reason for this time barrier was personal, and the only way to do this was to play Phase 1 like the Tas and get that extra jab. Over the next 2 weeks, Zalad focused on executing the Tas strat as best as he could. Letting Sandman throw his hooks naturally and hoping for the best pattern pushed the total fight odds to 1 in 114, and combined with the over 20 places in the fight where you can lose frames to execution alone, this would be by far one of the most difficult goals for Zalad to achieve. Zalad had several good attempts, but none quite good enough to break into 218 territory. There was just too much difficulty in saving the frames, along with getting the optimal luck to make the fight work. Knowing Zalad, he would have likely gotten it to all work eventually, but instead, he stopped. Because McHazard was about to unleash his Tas. At the end of 2013, the theoretical limits for 8 of the 14 fights were lowered, and among those 8 was Mr. Sandman. Because there was so little to work with, no one expected this fight to be improved, and Sinister One had to say this about McHazard.
This man is a wizard.
How McHazard found this improvement was so simple, it may have been the very reason why everyone else had missed it. Each fighter, except King Hippo, is a palette swap of another fighter in the game, and palette swapped fights have a lot of similarities with each other. For instance, both Sandman and Bold Bull have the fancy rolling jab where they spin their hands before launching the punch. It's in fact on the rolling jabs where McHazard managed to find the time save. On Bold Bull 2, the normal strategy begins with dodging and countering the rolling jab in the gut for a star. When you try to do the same thing on Sandman, he blocks. There is no guard manipulation required for that gut punch to land on Bold Bull, so why should there be one needed for Sandman? And since he blocked, everyone thought the punch just couldn't be done. All McHazard did was simply raise Sandman's guard before each rolling jab, and now it was possible to land gut punches. And remember how I said it was weird that countering the left-sided rolling jabs dealt 4 damage? Well, these gut punches deal 5. There were so many cascading benefits from these gut punches which I'll go through, but the big one was obviously the 4 extra damage you could now dish out. This meant 4 of the 5 nightmares in the next section could have their intermediate gut punches removed, saving time. This time save would then translate into Phase 2, where the trigger for the minute 30 DLX wouldn't be delayed by as long because you were still punching Sandman. Within a few days, Zalad implemented these strategical improvements and was able to score the fabled 153 second knockdown, execute the Phase 3 time-saving jab before taking his own knockdown, and finally, finishing the fight with a final time of 2:18.61. And would you believe it? Zalad didn't even get the best luck in this fight. Over the next few months, buffer strategies started to become more prevalent throughout the game, and the Mr. Sandman fight was one that would be one of the major recipients of that benefit. It was once again Zalad who would lower the record again, using these right quick dodges to land the delayed gut punch on the first frame of a 6-frame window every time. And this absolutely killer buffer for the 130 DLX. As long as the trigger for Sandman's DLX and Mac's first left dodge start on the same frame, then you can get a first frame instant triple quick dodge on the DLX every time, so long as you get the fastest delay. With an insanely fast 151 knockdown, Zalad could then open phase 3 like Mikazad's new Tas, performing a single nightmare before the knockdown. Despite taking the knockdown well over the 159 mark, the extra damage allows Zalad to cut out 3 punches at the end of the DLX, lowering the record to a 217.48 on March 21st, and then to a 217.25 a week later. And still, Zalad was not done. In early 2015, he would complete his final grind on the Sandman IL, this time fully utilizing the Tas strat with natural hooks and pumping the odds back up to 1 in 114. The ever-growing repertoire of buffers continue to grow, such as this one to line up the dodge for the first hook perfectly, and another to hit the wacky waker at the end of phase 2. Zalad would break the record twice more in his final grind, lowering it to a 217 flat on February 12th, and then to a 216.97 on March 13th, 2015.
Yes! It's f***ing done, dude. It's about goddamn time. That's it, man. It's a 9-7, too. Yeah, dude. Yeah.
Zalad's record marked the final second barrier that existed on Sandman. He had a 216.97, and Mikazad's Tas time was a 216.48. Zalad was already using the best possible strategy. He had just lost a handful of frames throughout the fight, which inevitably left him with a slower time. He is human after all. For the next 5 years, few players really attempted to break Zalad's record. Without the flash and flare of star punches, this wasn't ever considered one of the more fun records to go after, but that doesn't mean there weren't any more developments. Zalad had been opening phase 3 with a pseudo buffer, a slow dodge to get the timing almost right, followed by a slight pause into triple quicks. This was pretty good, but Mikazad had also shown something even better that was totally forgotten about. As soon as you get up, buffering 5 consecutive quick dodges back to back resulted in triggering the instant DLX on the first frame possible. At this point in time, most top runners would find little trouble with this sequence of inputs, but personally, this many consecutive quick dodges is something I would definitely choke. On the 17th of August 2020, nearly 5.5 years after Zalad achieved his 216, his record was beaten by another top player in the community, Lucandor158. After watching Mikazad's Tas, Lucandor decided another good spot to save time were these ducks on Sandman's natural hooks. Ducking optimally is usually a little more difficult than quick dodging, but in this case, you could make an argument that it's easier. There were nice setups to time the ones with delays correctly, and the ones without delays, you could just try to duck as quick as possible and it would usually turn out well. These ducks and general execution managed to save enough time in phase 1 for Lucandor to get a 115 knockdown, and this combined with the frame perfect DLX buffer in phase 2 allowed him to take his own knockdown at a high 159, a little ahead of Zalad's 2-minute knockdown. How much further ahead Lucandor was anyone's guess, but with the perfect quintuple quick dodge to perfectly execute phase 3, there was no doubt that this was going to be a new world record. The gap between Zalad's 2-minute knockdown and Lucandor's 159 must have been minuscule, because he had brought the record down only by a single increment, to a 216.82. Over the next couple of years, attention towards the Sandman fight would steadily increase, and it was all because of Piston Hunter 2. A year ago, I uploaded a video all about how the perfect speedrun of Punch-Out would never happen, and I go through all of the fights in order of the most to least likely to be perfected. Glass Joe, Don 1, King Hippo and Great Tiger all had their limits reached prior to the modern era of speedrunning, and the first perfect Von Kaiser fight was recorded by Zalad in 2015. For quite a while, these 5 fights seemed like the only ones that anyone had a chance of matching the Tas on, until runners got good enough to start thinking about the next easiest fight. The perfect Piston Honda 2 fight only has odds of 1 in 8, but the execution required to hit everything is exceptionally brutal. However, perfection was first achieved on this fight by Summoning Soul in mid-2020, just a couple of months before Lucandor set his Sandman record. Naturally, with the 6th easiest fight finally being knocked off, speedrunners now look to the 7th easiest fight, Mr. Sandman. The chase to lower the Sandman record would really start to heat up in January of 2022. Brandon De Silva was in the middle of his own mission to set top tier times on every single fight in the game, and Mr. Sandman was one of those he had yet to reach his goal on. Brandon would pull off a fight just as good as Lucandor's, tying the record at 2:16.82. Brandon would analyse his fight afterwards and determined that his ended on the very first frame of the 0.82 increment, meaning if he had just saved one more frame, he would have set a new untied world record. Brandon admits he had played this fight safe by going for the 2 frame slower Wacky Waker, but in the end, the final time achieved his goal. A few months later in May of 2022, Hefeman found himself on his own Sandman grind. In the realm of individual level times, Hefeman has achieved the pinnacle of excellence on every fight in the game, and he is the current leader, having the lowest sum of best with a massive lead of over 7 seconds. When it came to Sandman, things were no different. Where Lucandor and Brandon had gone for the safe Wacky Waker, Hefeman landed the 2 frame faster Kruger in an attempt to gain an edge. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be enough as Hefeman would be the 3rd person to tie the record at 2:16.82. Nearly a year would pass until the next player would try to lower the Sandman time. In April of 2023, J-Derg held a very respectable personal best at a 15:36 for the full game run, and today he is within striking distance of being the 2nd person to set a sub-15 time, or even taking the record. As for Sandman, J-Derg had the explicit goal of lowering the record to a 2:16.61, and as such, he was absolutely using the Kruger on every opportunity he got. There was no way he was going to waste those 2 frames. And then, there were 4. Yet another world record tie. J-Derg hadn't reached his goal, but was satisfied enough to at least have a break from the grind. Over the next few months, some people began to ask questions about the exact specifics of the Tas strategy. Basically, they wanted to know exactly how well they needed to execute to make everything work. Unlike every other fight in the game, Sandman has 2 specific time barriers where if you played too fast, the strategy people were going for wouldn't quite work properly. The first was seen on the older Sandman fights, needing to take the knockdown just over the 159 mark. It was absolutely conceivable that you could get to that spot too early and would have to wait to take the knockdown. This isn't a problem with the modern Tas strategy because of the nightmare that gets performed, but because McHazard had sped up the earlier part of the fight, there was now another time barrier at 1 minute 30. You can see here that Sandman has returned to his idle animation. Actually, he returned to his idle animation 9 frames ago, and you can also see that the clock hasn't reached 1 minute 30 yet. The buffer that lines up the first quick dodge for the instant DLX will only work so long that you've at least wasted those 9 frames. Basically, to get this absolutely perfect, you need to get the trigger for Sandman's DLX timer to occur on the same frame that he returns to idle, which means losing exactly 9 frames in the opening 90 seconds of the fight. This appeared quite tricky to do at first, but here's where some more punch-out magic comes in. There are 9 gut punches to land in the opening 50 seconds, and each one has a 6-frame window. Naturally, you might think that means there are 9 places where you could lose anywhere from 0 to 5 frames. Well, that's not true. In fact, for every frame late you hit a gut punch, Sandman's next rolling jab will come out 1 frame sooner. Incredibly, this means that it's impossible to lose time due to execution in the first 50 seconds. This is actually really great because this guarantees we will always have the same amount of spare time on each attempt, and this upcoming section has a ton of buffer strategies, which means a lot of standardized movement. This force hook here always takes the same amount of time and wastes 0 frames. Every move is buffered. From this point on until 1 minute 30, players would try to slowly bleed frames through a combination of delayed punches and suboptimal ducks. After the revelation that it wasn't possible to lose time in the opening 50 seconds, losing 9 frames in 6 potential areas made the fight much more manageable, and there was once again a resurgence in the interest in breaking the 4-way tie for the Sandman world record. Summoning Salt, a man that needs no introduction, was up next. Armed with the new knowledge, maybe he would be the one to break the tie. No doubt that the luck was against him at 1 in 114, but on just his 12th attempt, he would pull off his first 216 of 2023. If we look at his attempt closely, he had gotten a 116 first knockdown, which proved he was definitively on the back foot early on, having lost more than the allocated 9 frames. The rest of the attempt was incredible though, hitting the frame perfect Kruger, and by the time he performed the final quick dodges, he knew he had a PB.
It's PB. Dude! We got world record of a 116.
4 is a party, 5's a bigger party? Somehow Salt had matched everyone else with his own 216.82. This was a pretty unique moment for an individual level in this game. Never before have 5 people been tied for a world record that hadn't reached its theoretical limit. Having got the luck on his 12th attempt, Salt was far from any sort of burnout. Over the next few days, his luck dwindled and he was only able to complete one more fight. And if you were wondering what time it was, another .82. Lucandor jumped in and was prepared to help everyone out with the grind. He quickly devised a ROM hack that would replace the score section with data that represented how many frames were lost. Gonna be honest here, I have no idea what characters to look for and when, but it was a nifty tool to gauge your execution and make adjustments when performing real attempts. However, there was yet another problem. With everyone's execution homing in on wasting exactly 9 frames before the trigger for the Dreamland Express, the delay was almost always accidentally being manipulated to never give the fastest one. The total delay is made up from 2 delay timers, and optimally, you need short on both of them. Because players were trying to arrive exactly on schedule for the buffer to work, Sandman's 2 timers would always naturally end up opposing each other, either long-short or short-long. The first timer could never be known or controlled, but the second could always be precisely flipped to the opposite one. Knowing this, Lucandor also prompted runners to perform a manipulation. During one of the slow left dodges, they would try to press start for exactly 4 frames, and if the first timer was correct, this would make the second correct as well. Joining Salt in the grind were 2 of the other Sandman record holders, Hefeman and J-Derg, and a new 4th contender, Funkmeister. Funk is Mike Tyson's Punch-Out's new top runner, cracking into the sub 1520s less than a week ago, and also nipping at the heels of Summoning Salt for one of Punch-Out's most prestigious records. Just a few days after Lucandor released the practice ROM hack, Funkmeister would have his own breakthrough on Sandman. On his 340th attempt, he would execute the record-breaking fight. Funk was even able to recognize that he had played the opening of Phase 1 too quickly, and slowed down his extended nightmares, compensating so that the DLX buffer would work. With the rest of the fight going smoothly, Funk would break the record, for the most tied world records of an individual fight not already having reached its limit. Now there were 6 people with the Sandman world record, and only a handful more frames to save. Summoning Salt, Hefeman, J-Derg and Funkmeister would continue their grind. One of them was going to break the 6-way deadlock. It really is amazing that this tie occurred and so many people were simultaneously trying to break it. In the realm of Punch-Out, fight odds of 1 in 114 isn't too bad, and with the increase in knowledge and players' skill at the game, times that were thought to be unachievable were becoming reality. Matching the TAS on Sandman was never really on anyone's radar. Most fights you have a little leeway to do this on. Piston Honda 2 was thought to be another impossible, or at least very difficult fight. But the TAS strategy does manage to get the 0.97 decimal on the second to last possible frame, giving at least 1 frame of leeway, but this isn't the case for Sandman. McHazard's TAS achieves the 0.48 on the absolute last frame. If you lose 1 frame where his TAS doesn't, you will get a 0.61, but at least this was enough for an untied world record. The quest for the untied world record would end just a few days after Funkmeister's tie. Summoning Salt had been grinding fiercely, up to 6 hours per day. way more than he would normally allocate. Tomorrow, he would have a major life commitment and wouldn't be able to play for a couple of weeks. If he didn't get the record now, he was sure someone else would. On attempt 1220, he said to himself that he would only try 10 more times before he had to call it a night. And just 8 attempts later, it happened.
Oh my god. Yeah, it's not the TAS. It's not the TAS. Nah. I'm hoping it's not an 8 too. Oh my god. I was just about to stop. I was gonna stop at 12:30. So 3 more attempts. 2 more after this I was gonna stop. Okay, I'm done with Sandman forever.
Salt had a good feeling at the end of this attempt. He was pretty sure he had gotten at least a .61, but he never imagined he would tie the TAS. Following this, basically everyone stopped grinding Sandman. Everyone's motivations were dampened by the now unbeatable world record. So what's next in store for Mike Tyson's Punch-Out? Who really knows? I have said before that there are likely only 2 more fights where a TAS tie seems achievable, but they are both several orders of magnitude harder than Piston Honda 2 or Mr. Sandman. On the cutting edge, statistical analysis of the RNG is showing that we can nudge it ever closer in our favour, and what was once perceived to be far out of reach could soon be at our fingertips. Thanks for watching.